The 60s are regarded as one of the best eras for British football. They had a World Cup winning team led by Sir Bobby Charlton and Bobby Moore. Denis Law was regarded as the pride of Scottish football. And of course, there was George Best. For a time, he was considered the best footballer in the world and seemed to be in a league of his own. However, at the same time, he was out of reach for everyone. Not just his teammates who wanted to help him and perhaps tried to, but also out of reach of defenders, coaches, and even his wife. His story is more like a Shakespearean tragedy than anything else.
Gibbons on his right. Best again. And Best. Hook could lose it. It's Best. Best now. And there it is. George Best. Making space for his cross and
Only a few can do that, because you'd all be sat there, but you'd move forward. And the air of expectancy, you think, what's he going to do here?
He could run as quick with the ball as he could without it. It wasn't slow coming at you, it was like an express train. And you never knew which way he was going to go. He could check and he could go right and then he could go left.
He had a fantastic cat-like balance. He was just a will-o'-the-wisp. You're just never comfortable when he had the ball when you were playing against him.
The memories that he's left are sufficient to be able to say, yes, we saw the best of George Best.
George Best was born on May 22, 1946, in the Creagh estate of East Belfast, Northern Ireland. His father, Dickie Best, worked as an iron turner at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, the same place where the Titanic had been built. His mother, Anne Best, was a homemaker who devoted herself to raising George and his 5 younger siblings. The Best family lived in a small, humble house at 16 Burren Way, a typical working-class home in Northern Ireland. Despite their modest means, the Bests were a loving family. George was particularly close to his father, who shared his love for football and was always supportive of his dreams. His mother, Anne, was a kind yet strict woman who ensured that her children remained disciplined. Unfortunately, in later years, Anne struggled with alcoholism, a tragic parallel to George's own battles with addiction. Football was an obsession for George from the moment he could walk. He would spend hours kicking a ball against the walls of his house or playing in the streets with his friends. One of the first photographs taken of George was outside his grandparents' house when he was about 13 months old with a plastic ball at his feet. It didn't really matter what sort of ball it was, plastic, tennis ball, anything he could kick around. Sometimes he would even take the ball to bed with him. Unlike other kids, he had an almost unnatural ability to control the ball, dribbling past imaginary defenders with ease. His childhood hero was Stanley Matthews, whose graceful dribbling skills left a deep impression on young George. George first played organized football at Nettlefield Primary School, where his raw talent was obvious. However, when he moved on to Grosvenor High School, a strict academic institution that focused on rugby rather than football, he quickly lost interest in his studies. He despised rugby and frequently skipped school, much to the frustration of his teachers and parents. His aversion to school led his parents to move him to Lisnashara Secondary School, which allowed him to focus more on football. It was there that he began playing for Creagh Boys Club, a small local team that would serve as the launch pad for his career. At Creagh, Best honed his skills against older, physically stronger boys. Despite his small stature, he was exceptionally fast and had an uncanny ability to weave through defenders. His balance and close control were unmatched, and he quickly became the star player. It was there that he earned the nickname El Beetle, long before his rise to international fame. During this time, he also played for local youth teams, and his reputation as a footballing prodigy spread beyond Belfast. However, despite his brilliance on the pitch, Best remained a shy and introverted boy off it. In 1961, when Best was just 15 years old, a Manchester United scout named Bob Bishop watched him play. Blown away by what he saw, Bishop famously sent a telegram to Matt Busby, the legendary manager of Manchester United, saying, "I think I've found you a genius." In the summer of 1961, 1961, a 15-year-old George Best arrived in Manchester to join Manchester United's youth system, but his start was anything but smooth. As mentioned in his autobiography, the overwhelming homesickness he felt in those first few days nearly ended his career before it even began. After just 2 days, he packed his bags and quietly slipped away, returning to Belfast without telling anyone at United. He later admitted that he felt completely out of his depth. Manchester was a massive city compared to the tight-knit community of Crega, and he was a shy, introverted boy who barely spoke. United's scout, Joe Armstrong, who had worked alongside Bob Bishop to bring Best to the club, quickly reached out to the Best family. Armstrong reassured George's father, Dickie, that his son was an extraordinary talent and would give it another try. After some convincing, George reluctantly returned to Manchester, determined to make it work this time. Best was placed in United's ground staff program, where young players had to perform menial tasks like sweeping the stands, cleaning books, and maintaining the pitch at Old Trafford. It was a common practice at the time, meant to instill discipline in young players. Though he found these tasks dull, Best understood their importance in earning his place at the club. Despite his initial struggles off the pitch, Best was thriving on it. His dribbling ability, balance, and natural flair made him stand out among his peers. He was small and skinny, but his low center of gravity allowed him to glide past defenders with ease. Even the senior players at the club took notice. In Blessed, the autobiography, Best recalls how senior players like Dennis Viollet and Bobby Charlton saw something special in him. Even Matt Busby, United's legendary manager, quietly observed the young Irishman's progress. Also, the state of Manchester United when George was first arriving looked very tumultuous. After the devastating Munich tragedy of 1958, Manchester United was left in tatters. The loss of so many players, including some of the brightest stars in European football, left the club searching for direction. For years, they thought to rebuild, and the path forward seemed uncertain. But in 1963, a young George Best arrived at Old Trafford, a player with the kind of brilliance that could inspire not just a team, but an entire club. As United struggled to find their identity after Munich, Best became the spark that ignited their resurgence, leading them to glory. By 1963, Best's performances in the youth team were too impressive to ignore. At just 17 years old, he was called up by Matt Busby for his first team debut on September 14, 1963, against West Bromwich Albion. Best recalls in his autobiography that he was both excited and terrified. Walking out onto the Old Trafford pitch in front of thousands of fans was an overwhelming experience. However, once the game started, his nerves faded. He played brilliantly, showing glimpses of the genius that would later make him a global icon. United won 1-0, and Best made an instant impression. Despite his promising debut, Busby took a cautious approach. Best was still young and physically underdeveloped, so he was sent back to the youth team to continue his growth, before scoring his first goal for the first team in his second appearance in a 5-1 win over Burnley on December 28th. Manager Matt Busby then kept Best in the team, and by the end of the 1963-64 season, he had made 26 appearances, scoring 6 goals. Manchester United finished second, 4 points behind Liverpool. They reached the semi-finals of the FA Cup. The 1964-65 season was the turning point. Best was officially promoted to the first team and given regular playing time. United had a squad filled with legends, including Bobby Charlton, Dennis Law, and Nobby Stiles. But even among such elite company, Best's talents were undeniable. He quickly became a fan favorite for his electric dribbling, fearless attacking play, and eye-catching style. Though opponents often used rough play to try to stifle his technical ability, Busby ensured that fierce, sometimes brutal training sessions left Best well prepared to cope with tough challenges. Best helped Manchester United claim the league title. A 1-0 victory at Elland Road proved decisive, as the title race came down to goal difference between the Red Devils and the bitter rivals Leeds United. Leeds managed to gain some measure of revenge, though, by knocking Manchester United out of the FA Cup at the semi-final stage. Over the course of the campaign, Best contributed 14 goals in 59 competitive games. The rising star of English football, Best was catapulted to superstar status at the age of 19 when he scored 2 goals in a European Cup quarter-final match against Benfica at the Estadio da Luz on March 9, 1966. His impressive standout display, combined with his dark beetle mop-top hair, led the Portuguese media to dub him O Quinto Beatle, the fifth Beatle. Upon the team's return to England, Best was photographed on the airport tarmac in his new sombrero with the headline El Beatle. His talent and showmanship made him a crowd and media favorite, and he went from being headline news in the back pages to the front pages. However, United failed to win any major honors in the 1965-66 season, and Best was injured from March 26th onwards with a twisted knee following a bad tackle from a Preston North End player. United staff claimed it was light ligament damage to keep Best on the field for the rest of the campaign. He had little faith in the United medical staff and secretly saw Glentoran's physiotherapist, who readjusted his ligaments in a painful procedure. His last game of the season, his knee strapped up, came on April 13th and ended in a 2-0 defeat to Partizan Belgrade at Partizan Stadium. The 1966-67 season was a triumphant one for Best and Manchester United. At just 20 years old, he was no longer just a promising youngster. He was already among the best players in England. His dazzling dribbles, pace, and natural goal-scoring ability made him a nightmare for defenders. Playing alongside club legends Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law, Best helped United secure the First Division title, scoring 10 goals in the league and producing countless assists. His performances in that campaign showed that he was more than just an entertainer. He was also a winner. Best scored twice against rivals Liverpool in a 2-0 win at Anfield and claimed a hat-trick over Newcastle United in a 6-0 home win on the penultimate league game of the season. However, a home defeat to hated local rivals Manchester City proved costly, as City claimed the league title with a 2-point lead over United. If the 1966-67 season was about proving himself domestically, the 1967-68 season would be the year Best made history in the European stage. United were determined to win the European Cup, and Best was their talisman. After disposing of Maltese Hibernians, United advanced past Yugoslavian Sarajevo with a 2-1 home win. Best assisted John Aston for the first and scored the second himself, and was described by Geoffrey Green of the Times as the centerpiece of the chessboard, a player full of fantasy, a player who lent magic to what might have been whimsy. In the quarter-finals, United advanced past Polish club Górnik Zabrze 2-1 on aggregate, having held on to their aggregate lead in freezing temperatures in front of 105,000 at Silesian Stadium. Despite losing the away tie 1-0, Best described the defeat as one of our best ever performances given all the unwelcome circumstances. Facing six-time champions Real Madrid in the semi-finals, Best scored the only goal of the home fixture with a 15-yard strike that Alex Stepney described as one of Best's finest goals. In the tie at the Bernabeu, Best was marked effectively by Manuel Sanchez Martinez, but on the one time Best got the better of him, he made a telling pass to Bill Folks, who calmly found the net to level the game at 3-3 and win the aggregate tie 4-3. Days after returning to England as the First Division's joint top scorer, level on 28 goals with Southampton's Ron Davies, Best was presented with the FWA Footballer of the Year award, becoming the youngest ever recipient. Facing United in the European Cup final at Wembley against Benfica, the game went into extra time, and just 3 minutes into that extra time, Best went on a mazy run and beat goalkeeper Jose Henrique with a dummy before rolling the ball into the net. Two further goals from Brian Kidd and Bobby Charlton settled the tie at 4-1. The victory was not only the pinnacle of Best's career, but arguably Manchester United's greatest achievement, considering the Munich air disaster had wiped out most of the Busby Babes just 10 years previously. Best also won the Ballon d'Or in 1968 after receiving more votes than Bobby Charlton, Dragan Djajic, and Franz Beckenbauer. This meant that he had won the three major honors in club football at the age of just 22, officially recognizing him as the best player in the world. At just 22, he had reached the pinnacle of football. After this, his steady decline began. The European Cup triumph should have been the start of a golden era for both United and Best, but instead it marked the beginning of a slow decline. Even though the holy trinity of Best, Law, and Charlton were still as effective as ever in the 1968-69 campaign, it became obvious that the club's new recruits were not up to scratch as United dropped to 11th in the league before Busby announced his retirement. Best later said that, "I increasingly had the feeling that I was carrying the team at times on the pitch." He scored 22 goals in 55 games, though only he and Dennis Law scored more than 6 league goals. In the Intercontinental Cup, fans and players alike looked forward to seeing United take on Argentine opposition Estudiantes de La Plata over the course of 2 legs. However, Best said, "No one tackled harder or dirtier than this Argentinian team," as a 1-0 defeat at the Estadio Camilo Chiquero was followed by a 1-1 draw at Old Trafford. In the home tie, Best was kicked and spat on by Jose Hugo Medina, and both players were sent off after Best reacted with a punch. Despite their poor league form, United managed to reach the semi-finals of the European Cup. They had a relatively easy run, getting past Ireland's Waterford United, Belgium's Anderlecht, and Austria's Rapid Wien, where they were knocked out 2-1 on aggregate by AC Milan following a 2-0 defeat at the San Siro. Milan goalkeeper Fabio Cudicini was the hero after keeping United to only 1 goal at Old Trafford. By this time, he was no longer just a footballer, he was a celebrity in every sense of the word. The media adored him, women idolized him, and the nightlife of Manchester and London became his second home. Best had always enjoyed a good time, but after 1968 his drinking became more serious. He was frequently seen at nightclubs, often disappearing 4 days before matches. He opened his own nightclub, Slack Alice, and started appearing in gossip columns as much as in sports pages. In Blessed, the autobiography, Best reflected on this period with brutal honesty. He admitted that he was living 2 lives, one as the footballer everyone expected him to be, and another as a young man indulging in the excesses that his fame and fortune allowed. He famously said, "I spent a lot of money on booze, birds, and fast cars. The rest I just squandered." His on-field performances remained strong at times, but the cracks were beginning to show. He missed training sessions, partied excessively, and increasingly clashed with club officials. United improved slightly under the new boss Wilf McGuinness, but still only managed an 8th place finish in the 1969-1970 season. Despite the situation at the club, Best still had moments of brilliance, such as hitting 23 goals, including an FA Cup recorded 6 goals in an 8-2 win over Northampton Town in a mud bath at the county ground on February 7, 1970. Best's 6th goal saw him go one-on-one with Northampton goalkeeper Kim Book. Best made a feint to go right, which put Book on his backside before he went left and walked the ball into the net. Busby returned as manager in December 1970, though the 1970-71 season also ended without a trophy. Best began to get into trouble with his discipline. He was fined by the Football Association for receiving 3 bookings for misconduct, and he was suspended by United for 2 weeks after missing his train to Stamford Bridge so as to spend a weekend with actress Sinead Cusack. By the early 1970s, Best's problems had escalated. Manchester United were in decline, and his frustration with the club's struggles only fueled his self-destructive behavior. His drinking intensified, and his absences from training became more frequent. In Blessed, he recalled that there were times when he would disappear for days, only returning to Old Trafford when he felt like it. New manager Franco Farrell led United to an 8th place finish in 1971-72. Highlights for Best included hat-tricks against West Ham United and Southampton, as well as a goal against Sheffield United that came after he beat 4 defenders in a mazy run. However, he was also sent off against Chelsea, was the subject of death threats, and failed to turn up for training for a whole week in January, as he instead spent his time with Miss Great Britain 1971, Carolyn Moore. In January of 1972, his struggles reached a breaking point when he failed to turn up for training for 6 days. Instead of preparing for an FA Cup match, he was spotted partying in London with actress Sinead Cusack. United, now managed by Franco Farrell, had had enough, and Best was suspended. His relationship with the club had deteriorated, and although he returned to the team, his performances were no longer at the same level that they once were. With 27 goals in 54 appearances, Best finished as the club's top scorer for the 6th and final consecutive season. Best then announced his retirement from football, but nevertheless turned up for pre-season training and continued to play. United's decline continued in the 1972-73 season, as Best was part of the old guard clique that barely talked to the newer, less talented players. Frustrated with the club's decline, Best went missing in December to party at the London nightclubs. He was suspended and transfer listed at a value of £300,000. After O'Farrell was replaced as manager by Tommy Doherty, Best announced his retirement for a second time. He resumed training on April 27th. Best's last competitive game for the club was on January 1st, 1974, against Queen's Park Rangers at Loftus Road, which United United lost 3-0. He failed to turn up for training 3 days later and was dropped by Doherty, though he claimed Doherty was deceitful with him. Best was arrested and charged with stealing a fur coat, passport, and checkbook from Marjorie Wallace, but was later cleared of all charges. United went on to suffer relegation into the second division in 1973-74. The period between 1966 and 1972 remains the most significant in George Best's career. He went from being a promising young talent to becoming the best player in the world. He won 2 league titles, a European Cup, and a Ballon d'Or, and he produced some of the greatest performances in football history. But at the same time, the fame and fortune that came with success ultimately became his downfall. In Blessed, Best reflected on this period with regret, acknowledging that he had let his talent slip away. His story became a cautionary tale of how even the most gifted athletes can struggle to cope with fame and personal demons. Despite his decline, his brilliance on the pitch during these years remains unforgettable, and he's still regarded as one of the greatest footballers of all time. In total, Best made 474 appearances for Manchester United in all competitions from 1963 to 1974 and scored 181 goals. When George Best left Manchester United in 1972, it was the end of an era. He had been the most naturally gifted footballer of his generation, but by his mid-20s, he had already peaked. While many players would go on to enjoy a long and steady decline, Best's post-United years were marked by a chaotic journey across the footballing world, punctuated by flashes of brilliance, financial troubles, and an increasing dependence on alcohol. After leaving United, Best struggled to find a place where he could recapture his love for the game. His drinking had already become a serious problem, and without the structure of a top club to keep him disciplined, his career spiraled. Over the next decade, he played for more than a dozen clubs in different countries, never staying anywhere for long. In 1974, he made brief returns to English football with clubs like Stockport County and Dunstable Town, but he was far from his best. He moved to South Africa for a short stint with Jewish Guild and even considered retirement multiple times. However, his love for football never completely faded, and he kept seeking opportunities to play even as his lifestyle continued to take a toll on his fitness. One of his most notable stops was with the Los Angeles Aztecs in the North American Soccer League. In the late 1970s, the NASL became a haven for aging European stars, and Best, despite his decline, still had enough skill to impress. He spent 2 years in the US, first with the Aztecs and later with the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. He was named the NASL's best midfielder in 1977 and had moments of magic that reminded fans of his former brilliance. However, his off-field behavior remained a problem. Even in America, he struggled with drinking and discipline. His brief spells with clubs in Scotland, Hibernian, and Hong Kong followed a similar pattern. Moments of brilliance overshadowed by personal issues. He was still capable of extraordinary skill, but he was no longer a professional athlete in the true sense. By the early 1980s, Best was far removed from the heights of his Manchester United days. He made one last attempt to play at a high level when he joined Bournemouth in 1983. But by then, his body was no longer capable of keeping up with the game. In 1984, at 37 years old, Best finally retired from professional football. His career had been one of extremes, one of the greatest peaks football had ever seen, followed by an unpredictable and chaotic decline. If Best's post-United football career was turbulent, his personal life was even more troubled. His alcoholism, which had been a growing issue during his playing days, took full control of his life in retirement. Without the routine of football, his drinking escalated. He was arrested multiple times for drunk driving and public disturbances, and his financial situation deteriorated. In Blessed, the autobiography, Best spoke candidly about his struggles with alcohol. He admitted that he had lost control and that he had hurt those around him, including his loved ones. His first marriage to Angela MacDonald Janes ended in divorce, and his relationships were often unstable. Despite multiple attempts to get sober, he could never completely escape his addiction. He even underwent a liver transplant in 2002, but he continued drinking, which ultimately worsened his health. Even as his personal life fell apart, Best remained a beloved figure in football. Fans never forgot what he had achieved at Manchester United, and even those who had never seen him play regarded him as a legend. He became a television pundit in the late 90s and early 2000s, offering insight into the game he had once dominated. However, his health continued to decline. In 2005, at the age of 59, Best was hospitalized due to complications from his alcoholism. His final days were spent in intensive care, and on November 25, 2005, he passed away. His death marked the end of one of football's most extraordinary lives. George Best's legacy is one of brilliance and tragedy. At his peak, he was arguably the most talented player football had ever seen. Quick, skillful, and utterly unpredictable. His performances for Manchester United in the 1960s set a new standard for attacking play, and his influence can still be seen in the way modern footballers approach the game. Yet his story is also a warning about the dangers of fame and excess. He was a young man thrust into the world of celebrity at a time when footballers had little support in dealing with the pressures of stardom. His struggle with alcoholism ultimately defined his later years, and his premature death was a heartbreaking end to a career that should have lasted much longer. In his own words, Best summed up his life with a mix of humor and regret. "I spent a lot of money on booze, birds, and fast cars. The rest I just squandered." For all his flaws, George Best remains one of football's most unforgettable figures. A genius on the pitch, a rock star off it, and a man whose story will forever be told as one of the most extraordinary in sports history.